Welcome to this month's Creation and Justice webinar, a gathering place for building a faith-rooted and faith-sustained movement addressing many of the critical issues of our time. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ, and I am joined by my co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, who is the Executive Director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael, this morning I was thinking about that well-known beatitude that says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Jesus didn't say, "Blessed are the peace lovers." He said, "Peacemakers." How would you frame today's webinar in terms of peacemaking?
Listen, I want to say first and foremost that Brooks has a great point, and has brought up a great theological topic for this discussion. I believe that where we are in society right now and in this world is screaming, where are the peacemakers? Making peace makes you take action. It puts us on the offensive. Keeping peace is reactionary and requires us to act only when we feel threatened. The time that we are in is for us to make peace. We no longer have to wait for chaos and disruption to be uncovered before we act. They are already in the open. Those who are peacemakers are called upon to act right now. Make peace. Those who have witnessed an administration that acts with reckless abandon, we are being called on to make peace. Those who value children's lives and the safety of children are being called on to make peace. Those who believe the science and have experienced its predictions come into fruition through climate chaos and catastrophe are being called to make peace. I'm grateful for this conversation today and came in fired up. I look forward to hearing from our guests and gaining insight into ways we can also make peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for setting the stage for us today. Let me now introduce our guest panelists for today in the order in which they'll be speaking. First, we have with us Phyllis Bennis, who is a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies, working on the Middle East, Palestinian rights, militarism, and related issues. She serves as international advisor to Jewish Voice for Peace, and her most recent book is Understanding Palestine and Israel. She also describes herself as a proud member of Team Dog in whatever environment she finds herself, including long morning walks with pockets full of treats for the neighborhood pups. Up next, we'll then have Lisa Sullivan, who is the Senior Program Officer for Integral Ecology at the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, with a focus on international advocacy and education on issues of climate change from a faith perspective. She lived in Venezuela for over 35 years, raising her 3 children there and doing community organizing as a Maryknoll lay missioner, later serving as Latin American coordinator for the School of America's Watch, where she led citizen diplomacy delegations to 18 countries. Lisa is a passionate gardener and created a teaching permaculture farm, Canuco Calibre, in the foothills of the Andes Mountains in Venezuela. And then finally, we have with us today Tim Heishman, who is the Senior Advocacy Teams Manager at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. At FCNL, he leads a network of 135 advocacy teams in all 50 states who lobby Congress, publish in the media, and hold community events in support of federal legislation related to peace and justice issues. Tim is also a former pastor, camp program director, and conference planner, but his favorite roles are that of husband and dad and to 2 amazing children. Thank you all for being with us today. Phyllis, if you could get us started.
I started with thanks to you, Brooks, and thank you for reminding me. And thanks to all of you for joining us today for what I hope will be a useful conversation about the crisis in our world, specifically in Venezuela, but in the context of what's going on more broadly You know, someone once said, and it's certainly applicable right now, that this is a time of monsters that we are living through. The world is on fire, and it is our government that is more responsible than any other component of the world for making these crises continue. If we look back at January 3rd, when the crisis in Venezuela took on a whole new turn, and then look at how much more has happened since then, it's been a month and a half. That's all, 6 weeks since it. And look what we've had to deal with in terms of not just Venezuela, but continuing in Gaza, in Greenland, in Mexico, especially right now in Iran and Cuba, all facing major political, humanitarian, potentially horrific war crises that are making it a changed world from anything that we've known before. So I'm going to be talking about the foreign policy part of things. I'm going to talk about first the reasons for the US assault on Venezuela in January, starting with what it's not about. So it's not about drugs, first of all. We were told a lot that this is about drugs. It was never about drugs. Venezuela has never been one of the leading suppliers of drugs in the United States. There's small amounts that go through Venezuela, but it's not the drugs that kill people. Drugs was an excuse, and it remains an excuse. It was not ever about democracy. This one they've kind of abandoned. They don't really even talk about democracy anymore. There are plenty of democratic challenges in Venezuela. My close friends in Venezuela speak of it all the time. There is a left opposition in Venezuela, which plays an important role and is rarely spoken of, I think. But this was not about democracy. This was not about helping the people of Venezuela do anything. So we can put those two aside. So what were the real reasons? One of the most important was Cuba. For Marco Rubio in particular, he has wanted to overthrow the government in Cuba, to destroy the revolutionary process there, to destroy the country at whatever cost for decades. And right now, going through Venezuela was the way to do that, because it was Venezuela that was providing the last access to fuel for Cuba in exchange for medical support, security advice, a host of things. But without oil from Venezuela, Cuba will be and is right now facing an extraordinary level of humanitarian crisis. And this, for Rubio, is exactly what he wants to see. So this was a major component of it. The fact that right now that it's over in Venezuela in terms of the decapitation of the government, we now have an acting president who appears willing to say yes to anything the Trump administration demands of her in terms of where oil does and doesn't go, where the money doesn't go, all of that. But we still have the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln with its 5,000 or more troops on board, its 90 plus warplanes and helicopters that can bomb the smithereens out of anything in the area. And there are still attacks going on by the US against small fishermen boats in the area, in that part of the Atlantic and the Caribbean. So that Cuba is a major reason for the attack on Venezuela. Another major reason is the question of showing military strength. This was most important for the Secretary of Defense, who likes to call himself the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, showing off military strength, showing just how lethal our military can be. Well, we did a pretty good job killing somewhere up to about 200 people in Venezuela in what was supposed to be a clean action where nobody died, meaning nobody died from the US. People died on the ground in Venezuela. And for the question of oil. Oil, of course, is part of this. But it's not about getting access to Venezuelan oil. It's about control. It's about being in charge of where does the oil go and not go, making sure it doesn't go to Cuba, making sure it doesn't go to China. This is something Trump is very big on. So it's very much about oil. There's also consequences here for immigrant communities in the United States, for the Venezuelan community is being devastated in a whole new set of ways after being devastated by US imposed economic sanctions. And the immigration side of it is an interesting part because the key component of immigration policy in the Trump administration, as you all know, is led by Stephen Miller, who may actually emerge at some point, he hasn't yet, as an opponent of this continuing assault on Venezuela, because one of the very definite consequences we're certainly going to see as this goes forward is an escalation in people leaving Venezuela and seeking stability, seeking jobs, seeking economic health for their children, all of those things. And keep in mind, this attack in January followed a whole year of rising militarism from the Trump administration. Within days after taking office a year ago, January, they were bombing Somalia. Then they bombed Yemen. Remember Signalgate in March? That was all about bombing Yemen. That was the part we didn't hear about. We heard about the phone call and the journalists listening in, but we didn't hear about the fact that what they were talking about was killing Yemenis, right? Then they bombed Iran in collaboration with Israel in June. And then it was Venezuela again. And then it was Nigeria just before Christmas. So all of this was in the lead up to the attack on Venezuela. And we should be clear, the Monroe Doctrine, which we've been hearing a lot about, is not really just a guide for maintaining control of the hemisphere. This is an expanded version of the Monroe Doctrine. So yes, it's about controlling the hemisphere, but it's also global. It's also grounding militarism as a global policy. You know, the military budget this year is $1 trillion. And now Trump wants it to be 1.5 times that next year. $1.5 trillion. That's one of those numbers that, like, if you're anything like me, you can't even envision what does $1 trillion look like. I can't even really imagine a million anything. It's impossible to imagine. $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion directly to the military. So why are we surprised when somebody says, well, there's not enough money for schools and jobs and healthcare and childcare and all the things we need? Why? Because we're giving $1 trillion to the military. So the Monroe Doctrine does provide a guide of a sort. It's a kind of return to the 19th century gunboat imperialism. It was not gunboat diplomacy. Diplomacy had nothing to do with it. It was imperialism from the beginning. It was 19th century style. And now we're seeing a return to that. We're seeing that in Gaza, where the Trump plan is to run Gaza, to control it. It's not just about stability. It's not just about protecting, certainly not protecting Gazans, but it's not about protecting Israelis either. It's about control. Control not only of resources, but full control of the entire population, the entire society. So in the Western Hemisphere, the main focus right now is there. And we're talking about Venezuela, Cuba, Greenland, Canada, Colombia, Mexico. And yet it is still global. We're still talking today. I just got off the air talking about what's going on in the discussions about Iran, with the US now is negotiating with Israel over what our position on Iran should be. And then we have Gaza, where the genocide continues. The sanctions continue. So this has been clearly a link. We're seeing the link between Venezuela and Gaza. It was very obvious in the United Nations decision that was made last November, a criminal, in my view, decision by the Security Council to endorse and embrace and welcome the Trump call for what he called a peace plan in Gaza, which has nothing to do with peace, but endorsed a plan for an international military force accountable only to the United States, an international occupation, a continuation of the genocide, and they will call it peace. It's the old thing from the Roman writings, from Tacitus and others. The Romans brought devastation and they called it peace. That's what this peace agreement is about. And when we have the UN endorsing it in Gaza, 6 weeks later, the United States attacks Venezuela and the world says nothing. The world says nothing to stop it. So this link between how international law is being violated, how the UN Charter is being violated, you know, what the US did in Venezuela is completely in violation of the UN Charter. Nobody ever talked about that. Nobody ever asked the Security Council for permission because, of course, they wouldn't have gotten permission. So they just didn't ask. But the Security Council is the only part of the United Nations that's authorized to authorize legal use of military force. The only time a country can legally use force is in two examples. One is if the Security Council says so, which certainly did not happen here. The other is immediate self-defense. Venezuela did not attack us. Venezuela was not attacking us, was not a threat to us. It still isn't. Cuba isn't a threat to us. Iran is not a threat to us. So the US has no right to attack any of these countries. If we're talking about Venezuela allegedly on some of these boats, when we have no evidence so far, not one shred of evidence have we seen, but even if there were drugs on some of those boats, that might be a crime, depending on where and who and all of that. But it was not a threat. That's not a weapon. Military force is the weapon that is defined in the UN Charter, and that was not on the agenda here. So I'm going to finish in just 1 second, but I just wanted to say that what we're looking at now in Venezuela, with the permission of the Venezuelan government, is a kind of appeasement model that is potentially, very dangerously, a new kind of model for what US foreign policy is going to look like, taking full control without having to use troops, without sending troops on the ground, without anything that could be called nation building, which of course Trump doesn't want to talk about. So we've had full concession from the government in Venezuela that there will be no oil going to Cuba, that, of course, causing a massive humanitarian crisis there. But in Venezuela, we don't know yet. Where will the oil go? Who will get the money? None of that is clear. This is what imperialism of the 21st century looks like. It's not the 19th century kind anymore. But like that, it is the work of pirates stealing the resources, claiming control of other countries. And that's why we have a huge obligation to do whatever we can to stop it and reverse it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, for those illuminating insights. We turn now to Lisa.
Well, that was great, Phyllis, really giving the global overview. That was I feel so in sync. And my sharing is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to share a bit more from the inside perspective of Venezuela. I had the great fortune of living most of my life in Venezuela. I married a Venezuelan in the early 80s, moved there, and then later on worked for decades with Maryknoll as a lay missioner. And only left 3 years ago in 2022. So this story is really my story, and it's often hard to share without a lot of emotion, but I will do my best. Oil really writes the story of Venezuela. Um, uh, Venezuela has the world's largest supply of oil, 303 million barrels of oil, billion barrels. Now, this is what I'd written on the other one, and I can't bring up the other slide, but it's 20% of the world's oil is under Venezuela's soil. So oil writes Venezuela's history. So in the early 70s, oil had already been nationalized, was nationalized in the mid 70s. Oil prices went up, but then they came plummeting down soon after I arrived in Venezuela. And here I am visiting a family in a community where I lived for 20 years. And this is how most people lived, what we call ranchitos. So the price of oil really affected the varieties of oil, the Venezuelan people's lives. Oil also has written the history of what we have now, beginning with the arrival of President Chavez. In the late 80s, a decree was sent out by the president that had just been elected, who was trying to bend to the IMF and the World Bank and the money that he had borrowed on the basis of oil and not able to pay. So he immediately lowered the subsidies of gasoline. And this led to riots. Those riots led to tremendous repression, and that led to 3,000 deaths in what's called the Caracazo. This was February 1989. Many people in our own communities were killed. It was a devastating time. And there followed just a tremendous amount of angst among the people of Venezuela, following this repression, following these deaths, but also following the plummeting of the economy. And on the scenes for the first time came President Chavez. He came as a young lieutenant colonel who attempted a coup. No one had ever heard of him. They made what they later looked back on as the mistake of putting him on TV. claiming responsibility for this coup. And it was something that ended up being very popular. People were very upset with the government. And so he was put in jail, later pardoned, but later, a few years later, won the presidency when he began to realize Venezuelans really wanted more change to come through elections. So that to say that oil really, and the prices of oil and the debts of oil really brought Chavez to the fore of Venezuela society. And oil was really the basis of all that President Chavez did. There was just a whole new use of Venezuela's oil resources. Again, Venezuela's oil had been nationalized in 1976, but it became even more so under Chavez. But that oil really went to fuel an amazing set of social programs, which were called the missions. And I have to say, during these years, I was living again in very poor communities. It was quite extraordinary what was done with these funds. Education, above all, what they called the education missions. Just about everybody you knew was studying, whether it was older people, younger people, under trees, in abandoned buildings, from kindergarten to universities. And so education was a huge push, as was the health mission, a lot of help of the Cuban doctors, the eye mission. I literally had a friend whose vision was returned. He was blind, and then he saw. The housing mission, over 1 million houses were built. And so this, for the first time, Venezuelans kind of saw this oil money going specifically to social programs, so much so that poverty plummeted in those 12 years of Venezuela, of Chavez, from 50% to 23%. And so he was elected again and again and again. But Chavez dies, as we all know, of cancer, and Nicolas Maduro, who'd been his vice president, took over and was elected shortly after that. I don't want to get into all the details of what happened after that, but just basically there was a lot of conflict. The Congress was abolished. The opposition responded with violent protests, and somebody within the opposition declared himself to be president. So there was just a lot of happening in these years following Maduro's initial election. But really, I think what's important to focus on here, as people in the United States, was the imposition of sanctions. As Phyllis mentioned, the sanctions that were imposed on Venezuela oil. Venezuela's oil is over 90% of its economy. And under President Trump in 2017 and 19, sanctions on Venezuela oil led to extreme devastation of the economy, equivalent of 3 Great Depressions. We lived this out very concretely. The hunger in Venezuela was just outrageous in those following years. As you see there, it's 1,700,000% inflation, if you could possibly imagine that. But what we did really witness visibly was the weight loss. There I am myself, the thinnest I've ever been. We all lost at least 20 pounds. And so just tremendous hunger. That's how I ended up starting a farming project with children in my community. So the impact of these sanctions cannot in no way be exaggerated. This led to, of course, the mass migration from Venezuela. Another hard figure to fathom is that 7.9 million Venezuelans have left. That's 20% of the population. That would be like 100 million U.S. citizens leaving. Hunger drove them. Many people would say, in addition to sanctions, it was the mismanagement of the oil industry, the oil sector by the government. I think it both played into those factors. But in that mass migration, only 9% went to the U.S. Most of them went to Latin America, about 85%. At first, they got TPS, temporary protected status, and then that has been taken away. Kristi Noem has recently told them, you can now go home to that country you love. Of course, she didn't add that, and the country that we've destroyed. Another important piece in this unveiling story were elections, 2024 presidential elections. Very conflictual. The opposition claimed it won by a landslide, 67%. Maduro claimed that he won by 51%. I would say the international consensus is that there was probably the opposition won quite strongly. Their main promise was to bring the people of Venezuela back, to allow migrants to return. And that's what really the heartstrings moved on Venezuela. I think that's what they mostly voted about. But unfortunately, after that took place, there was mass repression, leading to 23 people being killed, 2,000 people being jailed. And the elected president, although Maria Corina Machado, the woman here on the bottom, had kind of really been the leader, she was not allowed to run. And so the other candidate, her candidate, Gonzalez, ran. But he had to leave. He was threatened with being jailed, and so he left for Spain. And Maria Corina Machado, the political leader who had organized all this, went into hiding for a year. So what was the reality that was left was that this was the slide that we're missing. 1 million children were left in Venezuela homeless, not homeless, without their parents. And in the face of this just devastation. But the U.S. response was one that had nothing to do with Venezuelan reality, that of the repression or that of Venezuelan children being left there. It was a response of, as Phyllis mentioned, organizing these boat strikes. They organized what's called Operation Southern Spear, which has led to 130 people being killed. And as Phyllis mentioned, there is no fentanyl in Venezuela. It does not it traffics a small amount of cocaine, mostly to Europe, but no fentanyl. So that's was quite the excuse, kind of the opening for the U.S. to get close militarily to Venezuela. And as we all know, on January 3rd, my children awoke me that early in the middle of the night, telling me that Venezuela was being bombed. It was a really, really frightening time. Shortly thereafter, Maduro and his wife were taken away. But once again, as Phyllis mentioned, there was a loss of lives. Again and again, the U.S. tried to hold up this clean and neat military action, but over 100 Venezuelans were killed. And hundreds of homes were devastated. So that is the other piece of that reality. The very other true fact that was stated was that what the U.S. seemed to care least about was democracy. The assumption was that Maria Corina, the winner of this Nobel Peace Prize and who'd led these elections, might be put into place, but she's been passed over in spite of giving her Nobel Peace Prize to President Trump. And Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as president and has been the president who the U.S. has been very much manipulating. She has no choice. If they came and took Maduro late at night, what would they do to her as well? But these two gentlemen on the bottom are really the reason that Delcy is in charge. These are the Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, and the Defense Minister. And what the U.S. cares about is control the Venezuelan population. And so Delcy, she's able to control them. She's coming from this repressive government, and that is the choice of the U.S. to continue with her. Outside of Venezuela, there was tremendous celebration. Many of you probably witnessed when Maduro was taken, but inside Venezuela, there was silence, there was fear, there was uncertainty. And so just again, to bring it back to the basics, that it was the oil that was really the cause of how the Venezuelan people's lives have gone up and have gone down, and really the cause of both the political moment of Chavez, the afterwards, the sanctions, and now the reason for the Venezuelans, the U.S. actions. This is an image of Marco Rubio manipulating as a puppeteer the Venezuelan president, and some things he's been able to have her do. Receive the U.S. ambassador, change their hydrocarbons law so that U.S. can now access their oil, and release some of the political prisoners. However, they've not called for elections. They've not released all the political prisoners. They've not made it Venezuelans able to get their passports, able to travel. They've done nothing to touch issues that keep 70% of Venezuelans in poverty. And so this is very much to they will manipulate her as needed, as long as she serves them. And this is just a final, I don't really want to end on that puppeteer image and just want to share. These are some of the children that form the core community of kids that I worked with in this farming project. And because the question was, what are faith groups doing? Um, Faith groups are all over the map in Venezuela in terms of how they're feeling. But my faith is in these children and in the people of communities in Venezuela who just want their country to be something where these children can grow up, can live, can work, and study, and are able to thrive, and that they are able to determine their own destiny. So yeah, that would be the end. And yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that historical context and uh, putting before us the role of the U.S. and then also drawing in that personal connection. That's much appreciated. We turn now to our third and final speaker, Tim.
Well, thank you so much, Brooks and Phyllis and Lisa. It's just been incredible to listen to you both. And thank you so much too to Reverend Michael for centering our talk with the beatitude that this is a time for peacemakers. And that's where I come into this conversation is as a peacemaker, a Christian called to work for peace, and have the privilege of leading a network of advocacy teams that work for peace. And this issue has been top of mind for us for the past uh, many months. And it began for us when we saw the boat strikes begin in 2025. We were really concerned about that. The strikes in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Um, we started speaking out right away that these are extrajudicial murders carried out without any evidence or due process, in blatant violation of U.S. and international law. And as we saw the buildup of military assets, we kind of knew what was coming next. But uh, we've organized this under the theme of no war on our neighbors, because as Phyllis said, this is about Venezuela, but it's also about Greenland and Iran and Cuba and Colombia and Mexico and so many other countries. So it's been like Phyllis said, it's only been 6 weeks since the invasion, and it's hard to believe. But our campaign, which we kicked off on January 5th, right away we had some votes to deal with. So there were war powers resolutions in the House and the Senate that we could vote on. This is a mechanism where Congress can vote to stop the administration from taking action in areas where there are hostilities that the U.S. is engaged in. So from an advocacy perspective, we mobilized our folks right away. And on January 8th, the Senate voted to advance a war powers resolution that would have required the administration to stop any further hostilities in Venezuela. 5 Republican senators joined with all Democrats in voting in favor, but the following week, for the final vote, 2 Republicans reversed course, requiring Vice President Vance to break the tie. But later in the month, there was a vote in the House that tied at 215, which means it didn't advance. It was winning until they held the vote open for a congressman to come back from Dulles Airport and tie it. But unfortunately, it tied, but it tied in both chambers. The Friends Committee on National Legislation advocacy teams organized to call in and email congressional staff, urging members to vote in support of these war powers resolutions. It was disappointing that they didn't pass, but it was impressive nonetheless that both garnered bipartisan votes and resulted in a tie, meaning there is not support, certainly not 60 votes in the Senate to authorize further military action in Venezuela. And furthermore, Politico reported the day after the Senate vote that President Trump called off a second wave of strikes against Venezuela, the timing of which is pretty obvious that the bipartisan vote caused the administration to scale back its plans. So it was encouraging in a discouraging situation to see that advocacy had real-world impacts to mitigate additional harm that was planned. There are a number of challenges ahead on this issue. While we have a strong bipartisan tie in each chamber, we don't yet have a majority. Technically, military action has ceased on Venezuelan soil, but the boat strikes are continuing in this new year, with one just last week. As the media attention shifts away from Venezuela, it's really important for us to keep the focus on Venezuela. U.S. imperialism threatens Cuba, Colombia, Greenland, and other countries in addition to Venezuela. So let me turn to how we can take some meaningful action and advocacy, where we can find hope in the power of advocacy in this moment. The first thing I'll say is that calls and emails to congressional offices really do matter. Of course, I'm not talking about the form emails, but personal letters or emails that are unique that you've written. It can feel like these don't make a difference because you usually leave your voicemail, or you talk to the staff member, or you send your email, which feels like into the void. But congressional staff do read these emails, and they listen to your voicemails, and they take your calls. And over time, when enough people advocate, I've seen things change. There was an advocate who told me during a recent campaign that they were amazed how the first time they wrote a letter to their member of Congress, they got back the boilerplate or standard email from the office, and they were really opposed to what the advocate was working on. But over the year, as their team and others in the state continued to write messages, and others not affiliated with us, the emails from the office changed over the course of the year in response to constituent feedback. So members of Congress will adjust their positions in response to the advocacy of their constituents. It is slow and it is gradual, but that's how change is made. We wish it were so much faster. I can also share that from one of our lobbyists, talked to a Senate office last year after receiving 200,000 personal letters and emails about Gaza. The office rethought their position after that wave of emails and became much more compassionate towards the suffering of the Palestinian people. And I believe the flood of emails and calls helped members of Congress find the courage to take those tough votes on war powers resolutions. And I know some of us, perhaps on this call, played a role in that. But the second thing I'll say is that FCNL really is guided by research from the Congressional Management Foundation and from our own experience, which shows that the single most effective advocacy tool is scheduling sit-down or Zoom meetings with congressional staff. This is far more effective than calls or emails, which still matter. But in a meeting, you can build a relationship, listen deeply to the perspective of the office, find common ground, and show wide support in your community by inviting a diverse range of constituents to the meeting. At FCNL, our lobby values are guided by the Quaker values of deep listening and finding common ground and building relationships. This approach doesn't lead to quick wins, but over the course of months or a year or more, we can keep attention focused on these really important issues and see progress. So I want to end with some hope, which is, I mentioned earlier that reporting from Politico that President Trump called off the second wave of strikes on Venezuela, which is huge. But right now we're working on two standalone pieces of legislation. House Resolution 6915 and Senate Joint Resolution 3344. I can put those in the chat for folks. Both of these bills would prohibit U.S. funds from being used to authorize military force against Venezuela. By driving up co-sponsorships from Democrats and Republicans on these bills, we can add pressure to continue forcing the administration to end its aggression on Venezuela and other countries. And we can build pressure to end these unlawful boat strikes, which are still happening. I take hope as well that the American people don't support U.S. imperialism and new forever wars. 2/3 of voters did not approve of the Maduro operation, and 72% are concerned that the U.S. will become too involved in Venezuela. Americans don't want a new forever war in Latin America or elsewhere. So lastly, I'll leave you with 2 quotes that inspire me in my advocacy. The social scientist Margaret Mead once said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And E. Raymond Wilson, FCNL's first executive secretary, said in 1943, "We ought to be willing to work for causes which will not be won now, but cannot be won in the future unless the goals are staked out now and worked for energetically over a period of time." So Mead and Wilson inspire me because they remind me that it only takes a small group of thoughtful, concerned citizens to bring change. But we also can't do this if we're not willing to stick around for the long haul and strategically and persistently advocate for the future that we want to see. So I encourage you to stick with it. Don't get discouraged when things fade from the headlines, but continue to talk to your community, to pray, and to advocate for the importance of peace and justice, organizing others around you, and using your voices for peace. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tim. We've had the good fortune of being blessed by 3 peacemakers today as our panelists. Thanks to each of you for what you have contributed to this rich conversation. We've got a question in the Q&A about PBS media coverage. And I think I'll probably follow this up with a question about New York Times media coverage as well. But let's stick with PBS. Last night, PBS Frontline had a special on Venezuela. So the question is that a trustworthy source of information is the question. And so first that question, any thoughts on PBS as a source of information these days on things like Venezuela? Go ahead, Phyllis.
Yeah, just a couple quick things. I don't think any of our mainstream media outlets are completely trustworthy. Having said that, some are better than others. PBS is better than many. I think with PBS, the problem that's more likely is what's not covered than false information or distorted information. In most of these cases, including the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, the problem isn't with the reporters on the ground. Sometimes it is, but rarely. The problem is with how it gets edited back home, what gets published and what doesn't, how it gets edited, how it gets changed, all of those things. I think right now, given all the attention that's being paid to the stealing of mainstream media by billionaires, the staff of PBS are very aware of how much they're being watched for exactly that, of caving in to Trump's pressure and there's been instances where they have, but I think less than most. So I would say that most of the time, most of what you hear on PBS is pretty reliable. The key thing is always, I never tell people, don't read the New York Times. Well, right now I wouldn't say that about the Washington Post, given what he's just done. I just did cancel my subscription to the Post. But it's not about don't read it. It's about read a lot of different things. Listen to a lot of different things. Some things, like in Venezuela, one of the things that I find almost never gets talked about is the nature of the opposition. There's this sense that the whole opposition is this right-wing cabal led by, including by much of our alternative press as well, unfortunately, that it's all led by the right-wing forces who want to jump into bed with the US, that are neoliberal whatevers led by Maria Machado. And that is a big chunk of the opposition in Venezuela, no question about it. There is also a left opposition that is viable and functional and much smaller. That is the reality. But organizations like the Citizens Platform in Defense of the 1999 Constitution, for instance, who come out of work primarily in environmental justice and indigenous rights in Venezuela. These are people who helped create the World Social Forum years ago, who have been progressive global activists for decades. And they have been critics of, mainly since Maduro took over. And they had criticisms as well of Chavez, but it was a different kind of criticism. You never hear about that. You don't hear about that hardly ever. So things that are missing are the problem. You have to do a little bit of research, find some alternative sources that you can rely on, and then recognize that a lot of that's going to be outside the U.S. La Jornada in Mexico is a good, reliable source. Here in the U.S. we have Democracy Now!, often very good sources. Not always. I mean, they make mistakes too. So there's nobody that's perfect out there, but there are progressive forces that bring us voices that aren't otherwise heard, and that's what we have to look for. But the key is to go out and find them, not wait for them to appear on your screens. You have to go looking for them. I think that's really the key.
Brother Tim, I heard you in your presentation talk about writing your congressman and being involved in that spectrum, if you will. But are there any other alternatives for those of us who would prefer to get in the streets and really just turn over tables and kick the thieves out the temple? What would you suggest, or what would you all suggest for those who are more radically charged, I guess, or more animated in their advocacy than writing a letter? I don't want to say just writing a letter. They're extremely important. Check.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And Scripture gives us so many examples of change making, and that's a great example. FCNL strategy, like our lane is the relationship building lane. So that's what our expertise is in. But we recognize there are other important ways to make change. And, I've seen, one of our, advocates was among the clergy who were arrested in Minneapolis recently. So, she was arrested for praying at the airport. And that I think was a powerful witness to what's going on there. Some of our teams have done really powerful vigils where they invite the community and the press to come in and be part of that as well. So yeah, I think those are some other examples, ways to make change that I'd offer. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? I want to make sure I don't leave anybody out.
Yeah.
I kind of want to respond to both concerns about press and what to do, and referring to us as specifically perhaps as our organizations here. Indeed, there are many voices in Venezuela that we don't hear in mainstream media, and we need to hear. And I think responding to those voices should drive that direct action. So I think we have the opportunity as organizations, FCNL, Maryknoll, IPS, to try to have forums invite those voices because they should guide, I think, once again, kind of how we should be responding. And I do think that they go between the cracks. I don't think that some really thoughtful voices of opposition, of different voices in Venezuela should be heard. So I would love to see that opportunity of lifting up those voices.
If I can add just one quick point to that, I think that's absolutely right. What both of you have said. I don't come to this from a faith tradition, although I work a lot with Jewish Voice for Peace. But I think that the question of protest is a huge challenge for us all. There are protests on a daily basis these days, and making the links is what I think is the most important thing. So what happens in in Minneapolis is not separate from what happens overseas. You know, somebody once said that how did it go? That the nature of colonialism is what happens abroad when, no, that fascism at home is the equivalent of colonialism abroad. They are linked. These things are linked. It's not surprising that in this administration and others, at various points in time, we've seen a simultaneous rise in domestic repression and international aggression. Those two things go together. The militarization of our police has everything to do with what's going on in other countries when those weapons come home. You know, the 1033 program of the Pentagon that gives free tanks and huge guns and things that never belong on our streets for free to any U.S. Local police department that wants them, is because there was a war in Afghanistan and they brought that stuff home fast. And now they don't know what to do with it, so they're giving it away to use on our streets against us. That's the link that can be made. I would just end with one quick resource for that. The National Priorities Project, which is now a project of my institute, the Institute for Policy Studies, but used to be a standalone institution, has a terrific website, which is nationalpriorities.org, where you can find out like the total military budget, or the budget for F-35 fighter bombers, or the budget for the assault on Venezuela. How much did it cost? And then how much is your city or your state or your congressional district paying in taxes, your part of that? And if you were not paying for that, how could that money be used for kids getting into Head Start, for veterans getting health care, for students getting student loans, all the different things that actually make us safe? So it's a great way to bring those international and domestic issues together.
Great. I have a question to kind of dive into that topic of covered by a couple of you about, you know, the U.S. and seeking to control oil. There's been some sort of coverage in the media, the New York Times and other places perhaps, that kind of portrayed as sort of a bit puzzling, right? Does this overt desire of Trump for oil in Venezuela, given that it's like the stick crude oil that's not very desirable for U.S. oil companies. Oil prices are low. The U.S. is already a net energy exporter, so on and so forth. So it's sort of portrayed as if, you know, Trump is sort of like a toddler grabbing for the steering wheel. But what is your take? Is that the case, or are there other forces at work here that aren't being properly kind of elucidated?
I think the answer is yes. That both things are true. There is this, I mean, I don't think, certainly not in my lifetime, but I don't know, looking at history, when we've ever had a government where the president was as personally invested and was making decisions based on personal interest. It's not only the corruption, that's certainly there, but just the decision making, I want this because I want the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, it's like unfathomable. And it's true that these things are linked to various people in various components of elites. One of the things about Trump that I've always found fascinating and frightening is that he doesn't really speak for or represent any particular wing of imperialism, of capitalism, of ruling class, anything. He's kind of there for himself and his family. That's what he wants. That's what he cares about. These other people, you know, what is Rubio's interest in Cuba? What is Miller's interest in anti-immigrant, hysteria? All of these people have ideological commitments. He doesn't, as far as I can tell. It's his own interest, his own family, his own wealth, but it's not the same thing as how this plays out with other people in the cabinet in each of these departments.
Thanks. Appreciate that. We are coming near the end of the time. I do want to acknowledge a couple of quick questions if anyone has sort of quick answers. One question is, what should we be doing to defend and support Venezuelan immigrants now in the U.S.? And then another question is, are there examples of environmental degradation that we need to be aware of in Venezuela that maybe aren't being surfaced in this conversation about oil? So if either of you or any of you would like to take a stab at those questions before we bring this to a close, I'd welcome your final insights.
I'll jump on that. I'm married to a Venezuelan immigrant, and that's not easy. And they are the last wave of immigrants and have the least amount of community support. So you see a lot of support to get back Haitians TPS or other nations TPS, but not a lot in terms of Venezuelans. And I think we just really need to be aware of that. We've devastated the economy with sanctions. Now we've invaded again, and yet Venezuelans have their TPS yanked. So I think just really be aware of the precarious situation of Venezuelan immigrants. It's also hard for them even to get their passports and go back home. Everything's hard for them. So just wanted to say that. Also, to revert to your other question about the environment, Venezuela oil is the worst kind of oil we can imagine, and would be horrific for our environment if we brought all that back on the grid again. So and Venezuela's over the past years, because their oil economy was sanctioned, they started doing other things for money, such as the whole mining, and had devastated a big part of the nation through that. So again, a lot of that was because of the sanctions. So it's complex. So oil is certainly not the savior for that country.
Great.
What she
Thank you
said.
for those responses. Go ahead.
No, I said what she said. That was it.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Unfortunately, it's time to bring this rich and engaging and illuminating conversation to an end. Michael, before we wrap up, any final words that you'd like to offer?
This has been amazing. Thank you for this informative discussion. I hope and pray that those who have listened will be moved to take action, to be peacemakers, not peacekeepers, but peacemakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I encourage everybody to look for ways to be a peacemaker, whether you're hitting the streets or whether you are contacting your member of Congress to set up an appointment. I know that there is a No Kings, as one of you mentioned, there's a No Kings protest on March 28th. And we'll also make sure that the post follow-up email, you can get connected with what Tim is doing. And so there are lots of ways to get plugged in and to take action. So thank you all for being with us today. Thank you for being peacemakers wherever you may be. Take care and God bless.